Imagine finding out your husband is plotting to institutionalize you. So you sell your soul to a mobster. When blind waitress Patricia heard a secret audio recording of her husband planning to steal her disability benefits by claiming she had cognitive decline, she snapped. She packed nothing and accepted a twisted offer from the city's most dangerous mafia boss. The deal? Live in his penthouse for 365 days, remain completely untouched, and walk away with $5 million. But the criminal underworld had other plans for her.
Let us open the file on Patricia. You and I are going to unpack this case together, examining the neurochemistry of a mind desperate for control. She counted everything, 47 steps from the diner's employee entrance to the first table, 11 more to the coffee station, 4 to the left, avoiding a broken tile. This hypervigilance is a classic trauma response. She memorized the Morningstar diner to anchor her fragile psyche. But the subway was an uncontrolled variable, a sensory minefield. The rustle of paper bags, the sharp toxic scent of wet nail polish, the unpredictable squeak of a child's shoe on damp linoleum. The city mutated every night, stripping away her carefully constructed boundaries and leaving her exposed to apex predators. Clinically speaking, physical exhaustion makes the subject highly vulnerable to manipulation. Patricia stood gripping the metal pole, her cane wedged tightly between her knees. She was anchoring herself to the only static data point left, the subway sequence. 14 stops until the safety of isolation. Her central nervous system was misfiring, her brain actively dissociating from the pain in her feet after a brutal double shift. She had served loud, aggressive corporate men who tipped a calculated 15%, just enough to absolve their own fleeting guilt. $61. She had counted those worn bills twice in the break room. A pathetic ritual of survival that highlights how deeply the human animal craves predictability when drowning. We must look at the math of poverty and how it fractures the ego. Her electric bill was $78. She only had 61. 12 stops remained when the environment violently betrayed her. A sudden reroute pitched the train car. A mechanical anomaly shattered her memorized pattern. Her grip fell on the damp metal and her cane clattered to the floor. Notice her behavioral conditioning here. A healthy subject braces for impact. Patricia chose to fall. She had been trained by years of societal rejection to avoid grabbing blindly. Creating a disturbance was simply out of the question, as it would only validate the cruel assumptions strangers formed in 3 seconds. She surrendered to gravity to avoid the unbearable psychological weight of public pity and embarrassment. But the anticipated impact with hard plastic never occurred. Instead, she collided with an unexpected variable: warmth, the dense, grounding weight of a human lap, and the luxurious, liquid friction of high-grade wool against her skin. She stammered a panicked apology, her conscious mind desperately trying to retreat. But her biology mutinied. Her exhausted muscles staged a complete rebellion against her panic, recognizing the safety of this foreign structure. Then a hand descended onto her shoulder, not restraining but possessing, placed with the absolute chilling authority of a megalomaniac narcissist who has never once been denied. He uttered a single word: "Don't," a low, vibrational command that bypassed her auditory processing and hijacked her nervous system. The command vibrated through her very bones. Now you and I need to observe the herd dynamics in this subway car. The environment went dead quiet. It is a primitive, instinctual response when an apex predator alters the atmospheric pressure of a room. Patricia could not visually process the threat. She could not see the violent ink crawling up his throat, or the gang affiliations tattooed across his knuckles and beneath his eye, symbols that triggered immediate avoidance behavior in every other passenger. She missed the subtle, terrified micro-expressions of the man across the aisle pretending to look at his phone. She did not register the nearby couple unconsciously shrinking toward the exit doors. She was entirely blind to the monster holding her. In psychiatric terms, this is where the cognitive dissonance begins. All Patricia registered was the deceptive gentleness of his hand, defying 31 years of hypervigilant survival instincts in a hostile environment. Her amygdala failed to signal fear. The physical weight of his hand silently instructed her to stay. Her exhausted body completely bypassed her rational defenses. Patricia Davidson, an impoverished waitress with $61 to her name, surrendered her autonomy. She kept her cheek anchored to the expensive wool of a dangerous sociopath. For the first time in a decade, Claude Stein, she closed her eyes and stopped scanning her surroundings for threats. This profound vulnerability is the exact fertilizer required for a traumatic bond to take root. She believed she had 14 stops of safe harbor, completely unaware he was about to map out her entire existence. Let us pivot to Paul Sawyers. He possessed the classic neurological profile of a high-functioning psychopath. Calculating variables constantly, he remained completely devoid of human sentiment. The man measured life in tonnage, in lethal percentages, and in the precise number of seconds it took to break a rival's psychological resolve. Paul operated strictly within absolute control. Unconscious women on midnight transit systems were not part of his operational matrix. Yet, an anomaly occurred. A minor logistical failure with his private driver had forced him onto the public F train at 51st Street. Pathological narcissists like Paul Sawyers despise public spectacles that they do not explicitly orchestrate. Despite the terrifying mythology printed about him in underground syndicates, he merely absorbed the inconvenience. He claimed a corner seat, wrapped in a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit imported from Naples, intending to ruthlessly strategize a dockyard extortion contract. Then the train lurched, injecting chaos into his sterile environment. Someone collapsed onto him, entirely ignorant of his lethal status. Her cane hit the floor. She did not scream or protest. Her head simply dropped against his thigh, and then she emitted a microscopic, barely audible sound. This lack of recognition fundamentally disrupted his psychological-to-superiority complex. It was a sound suspended perfectly between a sigh and total surrender. Stick with me here, as this is where the pathology takes a fascinating turn. She went instantly, deeply still, not medically unconscious, but profoundly asleep. Paul studied her with the cold curiosity of a biologist dissecting a new specimen. He cataloged her vulnerabilities, the frayed edge of her work collar, the hardened callus on her right palm, forged by years of gripping a cane. He inhaled the chemical breakdown of her environment. Stale diner coffee and grease, unsuccessfully masked by a cheap, floral drugstore body spray. To a predator whose entire reality was built on extortion, her raw, uncalculated exhaustion was an intoxicating, highly exploitable resource. Why didn't he remove her? His failure to curb the intrusion reveals a complex proprietary instinct. A heavy-set passenger 2 seats away, fueled by the aggressive chemical confidence of 4 alcoholic drinks, noticed Patricia's vulnerability. He leaned in, wearing the predatory mask of a supposedly friendly stranger. Paul executed a minimal, highly calibrated physical response. He simply turned his head. It was a slow, mechanical rotation, radiating the silent, lethal promise of a man who dismantles human lives for a living. The intoxicated passenger immediately regressed into a submissive posture, suddenly obsessed with his mobile device, never daring to make eye contact again. Then, a drifting teenager unconsciously breached their immediate perimeter. The teenager was merely riding the chaotic current of a crowded train, but Paul demanded absolute environmental compliance. He lifted a single finger, pointing to a handrail 6 feet away. The teenager relocated instantly, obeying an evolutionary instinct to flee a dominant threat. For 11 consecutive stops, Paul Sawyers projected a localized field of terror, maintaining a sterile bubble around the sleeping woman through nothing but sheer psychological weight. There was no verbal altercation, no overt aggression, just the terrifying gravity of a sovereign who understood that true violence is most effective when it is implicitly promised rather than violently deployed. Meanwhile, Patricia's destination arrived and vanished, while he quietly memorized her home address. She had tagged her cane with an emergency card, the coping mechanism of a chronically vulnerable subject. Yet she remained completely comatose. As the train terminated, a janitor approached, assessed the lethal stillness radiating from Paul, and wisely chose to vanish. Sitting in the harsh fluorescent isolation, Paul evaluated Patricia with the exact same clinical detachment he used for hostile corporate takeovers. She was neither a strategic liability nor a financial asset. She was an organism that had simply collapsed onto him entirely devoid of manipulative intent. In his paranoid, transactional existence, every human interaction was a calculated manipulation, To find someone so completely devoid of agenda was a profound, dangerous psychological trigger. She had constructed no facade. She had merely fallen. Paul withdrew his phone and issued a sterile 3-word directive to summon his extraction vehicle. He then sat motionless, monitoring her respiratory rate until a black sedan materialized at the service gate. "Come with me here, because this behavioral shift is crucial to our analysis." He did not wake her. He carefully lifted her, ensuring her nervous system remained undisturbed. The luxury timepiece on his wrist displayed 1:07 in the morning. She had been unconscious for 41 minutes. He had already clinically decided to abduct her, overriding her agency. When Patricia finally drifted back to awareness, the very first sensory data her brain managed to process was the absolute, crushing silence. It was not the poverty-stricken silence of her Delancey Street apartment, plagued by rattling pipes and bleeding television noise. This was an engineered, weaponized acoustic isolation built on absolute financial dominance. The second anomaly she registered restraints was the tactile sensation of her restraints. Having survived as a hotel maid, her fingers instantly evaluated the extreme thread count of the fabric. Premium Egyptian cotton, designed not to cover, but to totally absorb the body like a warm, paralyzing narcotic. She had been securely transplanted into a gilded cage. You and I have probably both learned this painful lesson in our own lives. The most dangerous traps are rarely made of iron. They are woven from the exact comfort we have been starving for. Let us open the psychiatric file on Patricia, shall we? She remained completely motionless on the bed, a classic hypervigilant trauma response. Her sensory perception, heightened by her blindness, mapped the environment through her fingertips like a forensic investigator. She cataloged the climate-controlled air and the lingering olfactory markers of expensive cedar. Her feet registered thick carpet, indicating extreme wealth. Then came the auditory stimulus, the calm, unhurried voice of a man operating with the predatory patience of a megalomaniac narcissist. "You took my train," she stated. The levelness of her voice was a desperate defensive mechanism, a psychological attempt to assert control in a scenario where she had absolutely none. "You took my lap," the subject, Paul, countered. Notice the immediate establishment of transactional dominance. We hear him stand, his footsteps all absorbed by the acoustic vastness of an expansive room. He halted exactly 8 feet away. a distance precisely calculated by a predator to project absolute authority, without triggering her immediate panic response. He placed an object beside her on the nightstand. The scent of single-origin coffee and artisanal pastry filled the space, an unsolicited provision designed to disarm her baseline defensive posture. "There is a contract on the table," he informed her calmly. Clinically, it is fascinating that Patricia resisted the offering entirely, maintaining her rigid psychological boundary. When she noted her visual impairment, his response, "I am aware," confirmed premeditated targeting. He laid out the terms of his psychological experiment. 365 days of absolute captivity masked as sanctuary, promising physical safety and a massive $5 million payout. The true pathology emerged in his secondary clause. If she developed a traumatic bond or Stockholm syndrome, the reward remained. When she tested her boundaries, asking what would happen if she declined, he weaponized her existing trauma. He calmly reminded her of her impoverished reality and her abusive partner, Mark. Paul meticulously positioned himself as the sole architect of her potential salvation, ensuring her cognitive dissonance began immediately. You and I must understand how conditioning begins in these cases. The coffee was cooling, yet she reached for it. Her motor memory flawless, a detail the narcissist undoubtedly logged for future manipulation. She recognized the expensive brew, realizing that every variable in this environment was strictly controlled. "I want to go home to Mark," she declared, seeking the familiar discomfort of her known abuser. Paul said nothing at first, then simply agreed. This absence of resistance deeply unsettled her. She had braced for the gravitational pull of a predator, but instead he utilized a classic psychological release tactic. He ordered her transport, demonstrating total compliance to disorient her severely traumatized brain. She retrieved her footwear, moving into a rapid, frictionless descent back to reality. The sudden sensory assault of the urban environment, exhaust fumes, freezing air, the chaotic mechanical grind of the street, stood in stark, jarring contrast to the sterilized, clinical silence of his domain. As she entered the waiting vehicle, Paul delivered his final psychological anchor. "The number is in the right pocket," he stated. Notice his phrasing. He said, "when you are ready, not if." This linguistic absolute is a hallmark of the megalomaniac narcissist, projecting inevitable compliance. As the vehicle merged into traffic, she immediately touched the garment, already succumbing to his invisible, meticulously crafted tether. The physical object, a heavy cashmere coat, served as a tactile manifestation of his wealth and impending provision. For 7 city blocks, she maintained physical discipline, refusing to breach the pocket. Yet her internal cognitive dissonance was already at work. She involuntarily contrasted Paul's controlled environment with her partner. Mark's volatile aggression, his financial instability, and the olfactory evidence of his blatant infidelity. By the 7th block, her defense mechanism fractured. Her fingers traced the heavy, engraved cardstock. She did not extract it, but merely anchored her hand upon it. Clinically speaking, she was already holding the instrument of her own psychological surrender, unable to discard the lifeline. Let us look at her return to her baseline environment. We see her severe trauma adaptations in full display. She retrieved her key from beneath a concrete step rather than a magnetic lockbox. Why? Because the lockbox produced an audible click, alerting her abuser to her arrival. The silent retrieval granted her exactly 3 seconds of preemptive psychological buffering. Pressing her ear to the door, her heightened auditory processing mapped the threat level inside. She identified the chaotic overlap of a televised sports broadcast and the distinct clink of glassware, against a structurally compromised table. She was continuously analyzing her environment for danger. A state of permanent neurological exhaustion. She decoded the specific auditory rhythm of a sedentary, lethargic male. Crossing the threshold, she was instantly met with Mark's interrogation. "Where have you been?" he demanded, not as an inquiry, but as a preemptive accusation. This is standard hostile conditioning. She registered the mechanoscopic stress of the degraded furniture under his weight and deployed a practiced, neutral vocal tone to calm him down. She offered a fabricated excuse regarding the train. He mirrored her words, weaponizing the repetition to induce guilt. He immediately pivoted to financial extraction, demanding her daily earnings. She confessed to generating a meager $61 against a $78 utility deficit, highlighting her entrapment. The ensuing silence was a calculated punitive measure. The excessive force he used to place his glass down was a subtle physical threat disguised as a mundane action. He weaponized his own hunger, blaming her for his 3-hour wait. When she offered basic sustenance, he rejected it with contempt. Navigating her meticulously memorized spatial grid. 14 paces to the counter, 7 to the stove. She displayed no performative hesitation. She was operating on pure survival autopilot. Hydrating at the sink, her sophisticated sensory cortex resumed its scan of the domestic environment. Almost immediately, her neurological alarms engaged. There was an anomaly in the baseline data of her home that required investigation. Her forensic analysis of the space continued. She isolated the auditory signatures. The broadcast, the unstable furniture, and Mark's respiration, which carried the distinct pattern of suppressed, simmering hostility. Olfactory data processed next. She detected discarded high sodium to her health, a meal specifically detrimental to her health, indicating his total lack of empathy. But there was an additional foreign variable present. She initiated a slow, non-threatening physical pivot, carefully masking her investigative intent to avoid triggering his rage. She approached the seating area, utilizing the therapeutic proximity she typically deployed to regulate his volatile, emotional states. She pressed her hand against the nearest fabric. You and I have probably both witnessed this devastating moment of realization in clinical practice. Her fingers identified foreign cashmere fibers. Simultaneously, her olfactory receptors isolated a sophisticated, expensive botanical fragrance, an extravagant chemical, while vastly exceeding her own economic capacity. This was undeniable evidence of a secondary female presence. Confronted with profound betrayal, Patricia executed a flawless effectual suppression. She locked her facial muscles into absolute neutrality. This rigid physical composure is a deeply ingrained survival mechanism, forged in childhood, designed to process catastrophic emotional trauma internally to avoid triggering further external abuse from her current captor. She announced her retreat, receiving only apathetic silence from her abuser. Navigating the perpetual darkness of her existence, she positioned herself on her precise section of the mattress. Avoiding the structural collapse on his side, she remained above the unwashed linens. And, clinically, this was the exact stimulus that fractured her psychological containment. It was not the concrete evidence of his infidelity, nor the severe financial deficit. It was the crushing accumulation of domestic neglect. She recognized that her entire existence had been systematically drained of psychological nourishment. She had been existing inside a hollow simulation of a relationship, surviving entirely on toxic echoes of stability. Her hand returned to the pocket, seeking the engraved cardstock. The physical density of the paper mirrored the predatory confidence of the megalomaniac narcissist who provided it. The ambient urban noise underscored the agonizing emptiness of her current reality. Paul had successfully introduced a contrasting variable into her psyche, the memory of true, insulated silence. She waited for the rhythmic respiration of Mark's sleep cycle to confirm she was unobserved, then tactilely processed the embossed digits, searing them into her memory. She initiated a 4-day delay. People often cling to the familiar pain of a known abuser rather than face terrifying uncertainty. The deepest tragedy of trauma is how it convinces the victim that their cage is the only safe place left. We often see this in victims of chronic emotional manipulation. Patricia's reaction wasn't stubborn pride, it was the clinical grief of prolonged devaluation. Her husband, Mark, exhibited classic narcissistic tendencies, discarding her worthwhile performing empty gestures. She smells the toxic chemical wrapping, perfectly aware of the lie. Yet she accepts them, grounding herself against the cold ceramic vase. You and I must understand this. Survival in a toxic bond often looks like passive acceptance. The lesson here? Never mistake a victim's quiet endurance for ignorance. They see the decay long before the final blow is struck. By the 3rd day, the isolation tactics were obvious. Her sister's phone was dead, a common severing of the subject's support network. So, she reaches out to Paul. Notice his response, answering immediately, without a greeting. In behavioral analysis, we call this dominant assertion. He dispatched a silent driver, creating a controlled, sensory-deprived transition state. She sat in the back, wrapping herself in the cashmere throw left behind, unknowingly seeking the tactile comfort of her new handler. It is a textbook trauma response. We often seek safety in the very shadows that consume us. The hardest lesson in life is learning that a rescuing hand can easily become a cage. Let us open the file on this first encounter in the glass tower. Even without her sight, Patricia mapped Paul's psychological profile instantly. He commanded the space, the heavy displacement of air, the dark, resinous scent of a predator masking its intent. You waited 4 days, he tells her. This is a classic power play, establishing guilt and compliance from the very first breath. He leads her into the engineered silence of his apartment, seating her on imported leather. It is sensory manipulation, designed to make her feel small, dependent, and isolated from the chaotic reality below. The lesson is simple. True power rarely shouts. It simply builds a quiet room and locks the door. Paul now employs a devastating psychological tool, the forced revelation. He instructs her to listen to 18-minute meeting without interrupting. As clinicians, we recognize this as dismantling a subject's reality to rebuild it under a new authority. Within 3 seconds, she identifies her husband's voice. Mark is speaking to a legal professional, their flat, organized tones indicating long-term, premeditated betrayal. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a coldly calculated disposal of a human being. It forces us to confront a chilling truth about human nature. Sometimes the monsters in our lives don't hide in the dark. They sit at the breakfast table and calmly drink their coffee. Listen to the clinical detachment in her husband's betrayal. At the 7th minute, cognitive decline. By the 9th, power of attorney. Mark is constructing a legal cage, demonstrating the profound absence of empathy typical of a megalomaniac narcissist. And how does Patricia react? With absolute, terrifying stillness. I have seen this defense mechanism in maximum security wards. It is dissociation masquerading as composure. She learned early in life that to show emotion is to give the predator a weapon. She sat there, absorbing the architecture of her own destruction. We must remember this crucial life lesson. The deepest wounds never bleed on the outside. They paralyze you from within. When the tape finally ended, the physiological crash was immediate. Her shoulders dropped. The belief system she had built around her marriage simply vanished, leaving a hollow, exhausting void. Paul's behavioral countermeasure here is fascinating. He doesn't crowd her. He moves to the window, offering presence without pressure. In forensic terms, he is establishing himself as the anti-mark, a steady, non-threatening anchor in her moment of total psychological freefall. He leaves a document on the low table. It is brilliant, really. The lesson we learn from this psychological chess match is clear. Trust is rarely built in moments of joy. It is forged in the ashes of our deepest betrayals. Now we witness the critical juncture of adaptation. She locates the heavy Mont Blanc pen, a tactile symbol of Paul's wealth and permanence. She signs the contract twice, her strokes deliberate and clear. Patricia Davidson doesn't do anything halfway. Her survival depends on absolute commitment to the new reality. Paul quietly announces day one. As the city hums far below, she feels an unexpected sense of grounding in this sterile, silent tower. She has just traded one form of captivity for another. It is a profound tragedy of the human condition. Sometimes, when a person has been broken enough, simply knowing the exact dimensions of your cage feels dangerously close to finding a home. Let's observe her coping strategy over the next 3 days. She methodically maps the environment, counting steps, cataloging the acoustic reflections of the open kitchen and the narrow corridors. This is severe hypervigilance, an adaptive trait developed by those who must constantly anticipate threats. She learns how the morning light shifts the temperature, how the study door creaks. More importantly, she learns the specific heavy resonance of the apartment when Paul is present. She is subconsciously tuning her nervous system to her new captor's frequency. It is a sobering reminder for us all. We possess an incredible capacity to adapt to darkness, provided we can memorize where the walls are. The grooming phase deepens here. Paul provides her with a massive bedroom, its closet perfectly stocked with cashmere, silk, and shoes in her precise size. By touching every garment, she realizes someone studied her intimately during her absence. This orchestrated provision is designed to foster a subtle dependency, laying the groundwork for what we might loosely compare to Stockholm Syndrome. She processes this invasive intimacy the only way she knows how, by silently adapting. She blends into the household rhythms, becoming invisible before anyone realizes she is even there. Here is a vital truth. True manipulation doesn't feel like a push. It feels like a perfectly tailored coat wrapping around your shoulders. By the 8th week, the behavioral experiment shifts from isolation to integration. Paul summons her to a 9 o'clock meeting without a single word of explanation, a tactic meant to enforce blind obedience. She puts on a dove-gray blazer, relying entirely on tactile memory, and follows him into a private conference room. She counts the scraping chairs. 8 men in a room built for 12. The atmosphere reeks of unchecked narcissism and illicit power. She pours her water and remains entirely silent. In these criminal circles, silence is survival. The lesson is sharp but necessary. When you find yourself in a room full of predators, the smartest thing you can do is make them forget you have teeth. This is a fascinating study in cognitive bias. The men in that room immediately categorized her as an inanimate object, furniture. They viewed her blindness as a total negation of her threat level. Patricia internalizes this without an ounce of resentment, because resentment clouds analytical thinking. A man named Doyle, carrying the vocal rasps of a healed broken nose, openly discusses illicit shipping out of Newark. Another man casually details a corrupted city councilman's schedule. They don't even modulate their tones. We must never forget this fundamental human flaw. Arrogance is the ultimate anesthetic. When people believe they are untouchable, they will happily hand you the tools to destroy them. Let's analyze the collective delusion of these syndicate members. They failed to perform even the most basic social adjustments because they assumed a blind woman was merely a personal accessory for their boss. They projected their own shallow values onto her, completely failing to recognize the active, recording mind sitting in their presence. Patricia, meanwhile, relied on a specialized coping mechanism. Her thumb quietly worked a silent braille note-taker hidden deep inside her pocket. She had spent 31 years perfecting the art of absolute physical stillness. The profound takeaway here is that invisibility is a weapon. The less people think of you, the more carefully you can study their vulnerabilities. Over 4 sessions, she systematically maps their criminal network. She catalogs shipping routes, debt structures, and the invisible hierarchy dictated by hushed names. Paul never demands this intelligence. He simply waits, employing a passive dominant control tactic. But Patricia makes her move. 3 months in, she stands in the study doorway and shatters the illusion of her passivity. Doyle is moving more than timber through Newark, she states, clinically identifying a traitor within his ranks. Paul's pen stops. He already knows, but she just proved her intrinsic value. It is a masterful life lesson. Never wait to be asked for your worth. Quietly gather your evidence and deliver it when it cuts the deepest. Let us open the file on Paul Sawyers and his subject, Patricia. You and I are going to unpack this psychological dynamic together. Notice how she kept her vocal effect entirely neutralized. Third chair, left side of the table, herringbone jacket. The silence from Paul was not a mere pause, it was a cognitive recalibration, the specific neurological friction of a megalomaniac updating his control matrix. "Sit down, Patricia," he finally stated. She located the chair across from his desk, noting the permanent, unyielding texture of the leather. "From the beginning," he demanded, requiring absolute submission. "Tell me everything." She folded her hands, a classic appeasement gesture, and began. The syndicate war arrived, as systemic traumas always do for an organized crime kingpin, signaled first by a deafening structural absence. We observe the classic environmental markers of impending violence. Syndicate meetings terminated prematurely, clandestine phone calls, and the heavy atmospheric suppression that occurs when a collective knows a threat exists, but is forbidden by the narcissist to vocalize it. Patricia monitored these shifts through profound hypervigilance, sensing the barometric pressure of the apartment alter when Paul carried the psychological weight of a crisis. She never asked questions. In this behavioral paradigm, asking questions is a fatal vulnerability. She simply waited as a conditioned subject does. On a Tuesday, during the 4th month, he returned at 2 a.m. She tracked his footsteps, the slow, highly deliberate pacing of an apex predator, conserving his diminishing physiological resources. The liquor cabinet in the sitting room opened and closed, followed by the profound stillness of a volatile man standing in the dark, calculating his next tactical maneuver. Patricia appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a navy silk robe, an unstated gift from him that reinforced her physical dependency. She offered him coffee from an hour prior. He noted she should be asleep. She deflected, claiming she was reading. Moving to the kitchen, she poured 2 cups without seeking permission. Subjects suffering from acute trauma bonding instinctively anticipate the unspoken needs of their captors. Men exhibiting this specific sociopathic exhaustion crave warmth, but are psychologically incapable of requesting it. She placed the cups on the low table and retreated to her designated corner of the sofa. Moments later, the auditory data confirmed he had crossed the room. He did not isolate himself at the opposite end of the sofa, but sat remarkably close. She registered the kinetic transfer of his body weight, his radiating thermal signature, reaching her before he fully settled. From a clinical perspective, this spatial proximity is critical. Over the preceding weeks, the auditory quality of their silence had mutated. Initially, it mirrored the hostile quiet of a hostage negotiation, two opposing entities waiting for a baseline compromise. Then it devolved into a neutral coexistence. Now the silence possessed a localized gravity. It was a shared psychological space where the narcissist temporarily suspended his defensive perimeter, allowing his subject to exist within his immediate strike zone. "How many people know you are worried?" she inquired when he answered that no one knew. She correctly diagnosed that he had been actively masking his psychological cluster deterioration for months. He did not offer an immediate rebuttal. Instead, he manipulated his favored silver cup. She recognized the acoustic frequency of the crystal, striking his expensive watch. Every facet of Paul Sawyer's was a meticulously constructed facade. His tailoring, his posture, the calculated suppression of his affect. It was a persona designed to terrify subordinates and command immediate subjugation. But Patricia was immune to the visual intimidation. She only interacted with the fractured pathology of the man at 2 a.m, isolated in the dark, anchoring himself to a simple coffee cup. "There is a faction encroaching on the port corridor," he confessed. His vocal delivery lacked its usual rigid architecture. This was raw data escaping the intense psychological pressure of containment. He explained their methodology. They do not negotiate, they merely establish dominance. He articulated the core paranoia of the criminal kingpin, the constant awareness that his subordinates are evaluating him for any micro-expression of fear. Patricia immediately identified his isolation, noting that if he is constantly watched, he is never truly alone in a room. A prolonged silence followed, underscored by a fading siren in the city below. He denied her assessment, but the denial was clinically hollow. She unhurriedly placed her cup down, her movements stripped of all performative tension. Over their 4 months of confinement, a profound psychological enmeshment had solidified. It was a clandestine structure, engineered through incremental domestic rituals, and the unique vulnerability of an apex predator who had unconsciously dropped his guard. This is the precise mechanism of Stockholm Syndrome. The captive becomes the sole emotional sanctuary for the captor. "You do not have to be alone in it right now," she offered. He remained mute for an extended duration. Finally, the physical tension bled from his musculature. The sofa cushion shifted as his rigid defensive posture collapsed. He did not need to articulate his emotional surrender. His respiratory rate dropped drastically, signaling a profound parasympathetic shift. The clinical breakdown of his psychological armor was absolute. Think about the psychology here. You and I have probably both witnessed this kind of emotional collapse. It is the distinct auditory signature of a man who has finally surrendered a crushing psychological burden. They sat within the artificial isolation of the penthouse, insulated from the city. Paul Sawyers, a ruthless syndicate boss who utilized terror as a daily instrument, sat entirely defenseless beside a woman incapable of visual judgment. For the first time in his sociopathic career, his vulnerability carried no lethal consequence. Patricia analyzed his respiration, processing the moment with clinical clarity. It was not a sudden epiphany, but the inevitable culmination of their trauma bond. This isolated stillness was the most authentic reality either of them had occupied in years. She vocalized none of these behavioral observations, simply categorizing the data deep within her mental architecture. The coffee steadily lost its thermal signature, and neither subject altered their physical position. But survival in a criminal syndicate requires constant neurological scanning. She registered the hostile intrusion (DSAIL) before his security detail did. This was not due to some mythological sensory enhancement, often ascribed to the blind, a narrative she rightfully despised as patronizing. She detected the anomaly simply because her baseline state was absolute hypervigilance. At 11:43 p.m., during the 7th month, she sat in the study, processing her environment with total cognitive bandwidth. The threat did not originate from the primary lobby elevator. The acoustic anomaly manifested in the utility shaft, exactly 2 floors beneath the penthouse matrix. As a survival mechanism, she had mapped every mechanical frequency of her cage. This carriage possessed a lower auditory register and a fractional kinetic delay in its cable tension. She had documented this deviation during her initial week of confinement, cataloging it as vital intelligence that sighted individuals arrogantly overlook. She elevated herself from the chair. Exactly 4 seconds later, the electrical grid was severed. The instantaneous darkness acted as a brutal psychological stressor on the guards. She identified the vocal signature of Briggs, a massive defensive asset stationed at the perimeter, barking commands into a radio network that had already been systematically jammed. A secondary guard propelled himself through the corridor. His erratic kinetic output indicated he was navigating purely by visual memory, and panic was severely degrading his spatial recall. The acoustic shatter of expensive Murano glass confirmed his total disorientation. Then the structural breach occurred. The violent impact did not register at the main entrance, but at the service door adjacent to the kitchen. This specific vector indicated the strike team had been embedded within the architecture far longer than 4 seconds. The power failure was a tactical execution signal, not merely a preamble. Patricia did not succumb to the amygdala-driven instinct to flee. Instead, she moved perpendicularly into the core of the floor plan, clinically counting her every physical stride. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Survival relies on flawless cognitive mapping, 12 deliberate strides from the study threshold to the sitting room boundary. She pivoted left for 4 steps, seamlessly bypassing the heavy trunk Paul utilized as a side table. 8 exact paces to the fireplace, her hand securing the marble mantel at the precise millimeter she anticipated. The sensory environment of the sitting room had dissolved into utter chaos. She isolated the auditory signatures of at least 4 distinct individuals. In behavioral analysis, predatory, objective-driven movement resonates fundamentally differently than the chaotic scrambling of prey. Paul's highly trained security apparatus was currently acting as prey, violently colliding with the furniture of their own domain. Amid the panic, her auditory cortex registered a localized, percussive impact. This was immediately followed by Paul's commanding voice, collapsing into a compressed, guttural frequency. The megalomaniac had sustained a severe physical trauma. She forcefully suspended any emotional processing of this data. Psychological processing is a luxury reserved for the aftermath, only accessed when the data serves a functional purpose. Operating on pure conditioned reflex, her hands swept across the marble relief panels of the fireplace, 1, 2, 3 segments with deep tactile depth, arriving finally at the 4th. This panel was completely flush, an architectural secret invisible to the eye, applying direct pressure to the lower left quadrant. She engaged the hidden mechanism and felt the solid stone yield. Let us open this case file together, you and I, and examine the pathology of a crisis. The hidden panel shifts inward exactly 6 inches. Patricia locates Paul in the pitch black, her voice a directed instrument. She detects the labored drag of his gait, the classic asymmetry of a man ignoring his own bleeding. When hostile footsteps approach, she does not panic. She summons him with a single syllable, spoken with the certainty of an anchor. His hand finds the frame, and she pulls him into the space, her fingers registering the warm, wet trauma on his arm. She offers no reaction as the vault seals them inside. It is a 3-foot gap engineered strictly for survival. The lesson here is quite simple. True trauma does not always scream. Often, it just waits quietly in the dark. Pinned together in the sensory deprivation of the bunker, she feels the erratic spike of his respiration. Paul is attempting to master his own agony. Beyond their reinforced barrier, an aggressive territorial display unfolds. Glass shatters, expensive objects are dismantled. The assailants are sending a primal message through sheer destruction. Yet, inside this void, we witness the fascinating mechanics of Stockholm Syndrome taking root. Patricia does not seek comfort from her captor-turned-protector. She does not tremble. Her nervous system has completely adapted to his chaotic orbit. She stands in the dark with an eerie stabilization. He slowly registers her absolute lack of fear. She has normalized the terror he brings into her life, treating his dangerous world as her natural habitat. He exhales the question like a ghost, asking how she knew about the room. She replies with clinical flatness, confirming she knows where everything is. Foreign shouting bleeds through the wall, contrasting with the shift happening inside. Paul Sawyers, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, finally hits the boundary of his own vulnerability. He is bleeding and stripped of his grandiosity. The ultimate indignity for a man of his profile is requiring salvation from the subject he believed he was dominating. She maintains physical contact with his arm, acting as a human biometric monitor. She measures the first 10 minutes entirely through his respiratory rate. She tracks time the way a long-term hostage counts the dripping of a faucet. Survival often becomes a simple matter of measuring the only variable left. His oxygen intake remains highly restricted. The laceration above his elbow continues to saturate her palm with heavy warmth. Within the first 30 seconds, she has already performed a silent triage. The blood flow is not arterial. It is manageable. Yet she withholds this medical diagnosis. From a behavioral standpoint, she understands that a megalomaniac narcissist cannot process logic when their ego is actively under siege. 12 inches away, his controlled empire is being violently dismantled. The audio profile of the invasion begins to shift. The frantic assault stabilizes. She isolates the disciplined footsteps of 3 security contractors, regaining their tactical footing. The threat level is dropping. The psychological lesson here is that panic always sounds much larger than reality. Look closely at how she processes the environment with us. She calculates 4, perhaps 5 aggressors in total. The initial shock of the blackout only lasts until muscle memory overrides the human startle response. Now, the battle naturally tilts toward the side with superior psychological conditioning. She maps the violent choreography through the micro-vibrations rattling against her spine. Her mind drifts to the imported Venetian plaster behind her, applied in 7 obsessive layers by a silent artisan. It is a textbook manifestation of Paul's obsessive control over his surroundings. Now, that monument to his ego is physically shuddering under the weight of hostile boots. It is fascinating to observe how quickly a curated sanctuary can revert into a crude, primitive hunting ground. The apex predator stirs in the dark. Paul attempts to shift his weight, but her grip immediately constricts around his bicep. She issues a single verbal restraint. He freezes. I find his compliance clinically extraordinary. This is not genuine submission. as a true narcissist never surrenders again. Possesses superiors his captive, possesses superior situational awareness. They are pressed together in a space barely wider than a coffin, engineered entirely for evasion. Yet the power dynamic has inverted. Months prior, during her isolation, she had mapped every survival tool on the shelving, using only her fingertips. She had quietly prepared for a war he never saw coming. True power is rarely handed over. Most often, it is simply and silently gathered in the shadows. Her mental inventory is exact. A trauma kit on the second tier, 2 heavy flashlights she actively ignores, knowing light bleed under a steel door, is a fatal error. A manual radio sits untouched. In this suffocating proximity, she studies his physiological baseline. Paul is a man defined by kinetic aggression. Over 7 months of her forced integration into his life, she has cataloged his microexpressions, the restless shifting of his center of gravity. Right now, his stillness is completely unnatural. It is the pressurized containment of a bomb waiting for a spark. Yet, against every pathological instinct of his ego, he allows her to navigate. It is a profound psychological pivot. Sometimes, mere survival requires temporarily dismantling the very ego that normally keeps you alive. You and I have seen this shift in power before in critical case files. She processes his surrender of control without any triumph. Beyond the reinforced walls, a sharp command cuts the air. The heavy front doors cycle open, then slam shut. Hostile boots retreat toward the elevators. Soon the deep cadence of Briggs filters through, confirming the perimeter over a restored frequency. The acute violence has evaporated, leaving only the grim logistics of the aftermath. Her muscle memory activates. She blindly navigates to the second shelf, her fingers hooking the latches of the hard-sided trauma case. She dampens the sharp click of the plastic by pressing it tightly against her hip. In the aftermath of any chaos, silent discipline is the only metric separating the living from the dead. She issues a direct order for his arm. He complies immediately. There is no defensive deflection typical of a wounded narcissist. He simply offers his bleeding limb into the void. She seizes it, operating entirely by tactile feedback. Her fingertips map the torn flesh with the academic precision of someone who realized long ago, that no savior was coming for her. The laceration is deep, but it will not be his cause of death tonight. She applies the dressing with mechanical focus, deliberately compartmentalizing the man from the injury. Yet, his psychological gravity is suffocating. She feels the intense heat radiating from his skin. She senses the predatory weight of his unseen stare in the dark. It presses against her skin like a sudden, severe drop in barometric pressure. Let us dissect this interaction together. He notes that she navigated directly to him in the chaos. His voice drops its usual theatrical manipulation. She replies with chilling clinical observation. She reveals she knew exactly where he stood because he always assumes the same tactical position during conflict, left of center near an exit for escape, yet distanced enough to project dominance. She pulls the bandage tight and admits she has been psychologically profiling him for months. The heavy silence that fills the box marks a sudden collapse in his ego. He finally admits his failure, stating he brought her here to provide protection. She agrees with zero emotion, acknowledging his grandiosity failed. To survive a predator, you must study its habits until you know them better than it does. She bluntly confirms his failure. From the other side of the steel, Briggs executes the prearranged knock sequence. Naturally, Patricia has memorized this protocol. She steps aside, allowing the narcissist to reclaim his physical autonomy and open the hatch. The door swings inward, welcoming a wash of sickly amber emergency lighting. The atmospheric pressure instantly neutralizes. Paul steps out into the wreckage. He surveys the absolute desecration of his environment. The shattered Italian glass, the overturned designer trunks, a meticulously constructed facade of untouchable power, humiliated and rearranged in a mere 12 minutes. The psychological wreckage is profound. Physical violence is often the most economical method to shatter a man's inflated sense of absolute control. He stands paralyzed in the silence. When he finally rotates to face her, the psychiatric tension is palpable. The emotional containment he has maintained for months has violently ruptured. She senses the heavy fixation radiating from him, yet she refuses to prompt a confession. From a clinical standpoint, articulating a trauma bond too early can shatter its architecture. She simply steps out of her dark sanctuary and into the amber glow of his ruined empire. Her hand locates her cane against the battered drywall. She plants herself firmly beside her captor amid the shattered glass, offering him nothing but her silent presence. Sometimes, a shared trauma creates a bond far more dangerous than hate. Standing in the graveyard of his own making, the narcissist simply breathes her name, Patricia. You and I are going to unpack a classic psychiatric case file today, one that perfectly illustrates the insidious nature of trauma bonding. Just her name, spoken in that unperformed register typical of a pathological manipulator. Patricia turned toward it. Day 366 arrived the way profound psychological shifts often do, quietly. She had tracked the preceding year through the obsessive hypervigilance, monitoring the shifting morning light and the silent Venetian morning light and the silent Venetian craftsman during the 6-week restoration. Her body had absorbed the geography of this rebuilt cage. It is a textbook adaptation response. When a victim stops fighting the hostile environment, stops translating the danger, and simply learns to speak its twisted language fluently. She was waiting in the sitting room when Paul entered at 9 in the morning. His pace was deliberate, projecting the chilling of a megalomaniacal narcissist who dictates reality itself, He sat across from her and placed an object on the table. Patricia didn't reach for it. Her conditioned passivity held her totally frozen. "The year is fulfilled," he announced, executing his psychological script. "The threat is neutralized. Doyle's arrangement has been dismantled." He detailed how the Port Corridor family reached terms in September. When he reminded her she was present for 2 of those coercive conversations, she simply agreed. The account was funded with $5 million. It was a textbook display of coercive control, neatly disguised as a simple business transaction. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? "The transfer clears today," Paul stated, letting a calculated pause hang in the air. He presented the signed contract, telling Patricia she was finally free to go. Outside, the indifferent November morning continued with the distant percussion of construction and blaring cab horns, oblivious to the profound psychological capture occurring inside this glass tower. Patricia reached out and found the thick paper, feeling the worn fold lines from a year of anxious consultation. Her fingers mapped the surface, reading it completely and methodically. This is a crucial behavioral marker. The victim grounding herself in tactile reality when confronted with the terrifying prospect of sudden, unmoored freedom after prolonged psychological subjugation. At the bottom lay her signature, clean and certain, identical to the mark 18 minutes of recorded audio, while of 18 minutes of recorded audio still ravaged her nervous system. Holding the document, Patricia's mind regressed to Delancey Street. She remembered the wobble-legged table and the $61 in her worn apron. Her previous life had been systematically hollowed out by Paul, a man who weaponized her blindness as a tactical vulnerability. She recalled her first night in his rebuilt apartment, waking in high-thread count sheets enveloped in an engineered silence that carried a heavy psychological price. She thought of memorized shipping contacts and Doyle's breathing, meticulously documented in her compressed Braille shorthand as a desperate survival mechanism. Patricia remembered the claustrophobic 3-foot panic room and how Paul had extended his arm in the dark without resistance. She fixated on the specific, amber-lit quality of his voice when he said her name. In clinical terms, we see the foundation of severe Stockholm Syndrome taking root here. Much like the tragic case of Luca and the infamous kingpin Vittorio, Patricia interpreted her captor's predatory focus as genuine affection. She believed she was finally being seen rather than simply watched. Society had always monitored her with the invasive gaze of pity reserved for the fragile. But Paul's attention felt different. She mistook the accumulated weight of shared mornings and cold coffee for intimacy, failing to recognize the dark, manipulative architecture of a master captor. We must critically examine how Paul Hammerful framed his control. He stocked her closet with garments, organized by occasion, presenting his absolute domination over her environment as a respectful form of logic. He would sit in the dark at 2 a.m, displaying a calculated vulnerability. He knew precisely what she was capable of, because a predator always studies their prey. Yet, in the quiet of that glass tower, Patricia rationalized this manipulation. She tragically concluded that after 31 years of being looked past, she had spent 8 months being truly known. The devastating reality of trauma bonding is that the victim cannot return from this distorted perception. She was completely unwilling to trade this toxic, manufactured validation for $5 million and her freedom. In a gesture of ultimate psychological surrender, masked as empowerment, Patricia tore the contract in half. The sound was crisp and final, the heavy paper resisting before yielding. A perfect metaphor for her own shattered defenses, she placed the halves on the table, folding her hands with chilling compliance. The room fell dead silent. "Patricia," Paul said, using that architecturally hollow, late-night voice. "I am aware of what I am doing," she countered, demanding it be noted on the record. She insisted she wasn't staying out of sheer desperation, proudly declaring she had $5 about his criminal operation than anyone else in the city. She kept her voice perfectly level, clinically detached from the absolute tragedy of her own total subjugation. "I am staying because this is the only room where the lights being on or off does not change what anyone sees," she told him. This rationalization highlights a painful truth. Victims often sacrifice their autonomy for the illusion of acceptance. Paul exhaled with the dark satisfaction of a conqueror. His heavy, ringed hand reached across the table, covering both of hers. It was the exact same hand that had forcefully pressed her down on a midnight train under the guise of keeping her safe. He held her hands in total silence. Understanding his physical dominance spoke louder than verbal commands. Here is the tragic lesson you and I must remember. True, authentic safety empowers you to walk out the door. It never expertly conditions you to willingly lock yourself inside your own cage. She turned her hands over, returning his grasp and sealing the trauma bond. High above the ordinary distances separating healthy individuals, Patricia sat in the engineered isolation of the glass tower. She felt a quiet, devastating certainty moving through her. The delusion that she was exactly where she had decided to be. She convinced herself she had not fallen into a predator's snare, but had actively chosen this captivity. The torn contract remained on the table between them like a discarded lifeline, and neither made a move to clear it away. It is the ultimate victory of a megalomaniacal narcissist, rewriting a victim's reality so thoroughly that the captive fiercely defends their invisible chains, fully believing they forged the iron locks themselves. A tragic, flawless capture.
I would say this story has a deep emotional atmosphere, a strong psychological hook, and a meaningful educational message hidden beneath its dark romance structure. The story begins with Patricia, a blind waitress, exhausted after a long shift, falling asleep by accident on the lap of Paul Sawyers, a powerful and feared man. This unusual opening immediately captures attention because it combines vulnerability, mystery, danger, and unexpected tenderness. But the real strength of the story is not only in its romantic tension. Its deeper value lies in how it explores dignity, emotional neglect, power, attention, and the difference between being watched and being truly seen. The first important lesson from the story is that vulnerability does not mean weakness. Patricia is blind, tired, financially struggling, and trapped in a painful relationship with Mark. Many people around her underestimate her because of her blindness. They assume she cannot notice things, cannot understand situations, or cannot protect herself. But the story shows the opposite. Patricia is observant, intelligent, disciplined, and emotionally strong. She counts steps, memorizes spaces, reads sound, texture, movement, and silence with remarkable precision. Her blindness is not written as helplessness. Instead, the story teaches that people should not be judged by what they lack, but by how they adapt, learn, and survive. The second lesson is about emotional neglect and quiet abuse. Mark does not need to shout or physically harm Patricia for the audience to understand that the relationship is damaging. His cold questions, his financial pressure, his lack of care, the perfume on the couch, and later the recording about power of attorney reveal a deeper betrayal. He sees Patricia not as a person, but as someone he can control and benefit from. This is an important educational message. Abuse is not always loud. Sometimes it is hidden in manipulation, financial control, emotional neglect, and the slow destruction of a person's confidence. Viewers should learn that if someone uses your vulnerability as an opportunity to control you, that is not love. The third lesson is that being looked at is not the same as being seen. Patricia has lived in a world where people constantly observe her blindness, but rarely understand her as a complete person. Society watches her with pity, suspicion, or low expectations. Paul, however, begins to notice her differently. He pays attention to her intelligence, her calmness, her memory, her ability to understand rooms and people. This difference is central to the story. Being watched can feel like surveillance. Being seen feels like recognition. A person is truly seen when someone notices their strength, respects their mind, and does not reduce them to their weakness. The fourth lesson is about power and respect. Paul is a dangerous and powerful man, but the story becomes meaningful because he does not treat Patricia as decoration or weakness. At first, he offers her a contract, stay for 365 days and receive financial freedom. In a typical power imbalance, this could become exploitation. But the story slowly changes when Paul begins to respect Patricia's abilities. He realizes she hears, remembers, and understands more than the men around him. She becomes valuable not because she is helpless, but because she is capable. This is a powerful message for leadership and relationships. Real respect begins when we stop assuming and start observing. The fifth lesson is about intelligence that society often overlooks. The men in Paul's meetings dismiss Patricia because she is blind. They speak freely in front of her because they assume she is not a witness. This mistake becomes their weakness. Patricia listens carefully, records information in her own system, and eventually uncovers betrayal inside Paul's operation. This part of the story is especially educational. It shows how prejudice makes people careless. When we underestimate others because of disability, class, gender, or appearance, we reveal more about our ignorance than about their ability. The sixth lesson is about healing through safety. Patricia's old life was full of noise, stress, unpaid bills, and emotional emptiness. Paul's apartment gives her silence, comfort, and security. But the true healing does not come from luxury alone. Expensive sheets, beautiful clothes, and a quiet home are not enough by themselves. What changes Patricia is the experience of being respected. Paul does not constantly explain her blindness to her. He does not treat her like a fragile object. He creates space, gives her information, and eventually trusts her judgment. This teaches that real care is not about making someone dependent. Real care helps a person feel more capable, not less. The seventh lesson is about choice. At the beginning, Patricia falls into Paul's world by accident. Later, she signs the contract after discovering Mark's betrayal. But by the end, she is no longer simply reacting to circumstances. When the 365 days end, Paul tells her she is free to go and that the money is hers. Patricia tears the contract in half and chooses to stay. This moment matters because it changes the meaning of the entire relationship. She is no longer staying because she is trapped, poor, or desperate. She is staying because she has decided that this is the place where she is known, valued, and respected. The educational message is clear. Love is meaningful only when it is chosen freely. From a YouTube content perspective, this story has several strong elements. The opening is memorable, a blind waitress falling asleep on the lap of a feared man in a subway. It creates immediate curiosity. Who is he? Why does everyone fear him? Why does he protect her instead of pushing her away? The story also has strong emotional contrast. The noisy subway versus engineered silence, poverty versus luxury, pity versus respect, darkness versus understanding. These contrasts make the story cinematic and engaging for viewers. However, if this story is presented as educational YouTube content, the narrator should avoid romanticizing unhealthy power imbalance too much. The contract, the money, and Paul's control over Patricia's environment can raise serious questions. The meaningful angle is not a powerful man saves a helpless woman. That would be too shallow. The better message is, a woman who has been underestimated discovers that her mind, attention, and choices are powerful. Paul does not simply rescue Patricia. Patricia also saves Paul in a different way. She sees danger when others miss it, uncovers betrayal, helps him survive, and gives him a form of emotional honesty he has not experienced in years. The story is also valuable because it challenges the common idea that love is only about passion. Here, love grows through attention. It grows through shared silence, coffee, trust, information, protection, and respect. Paul's most meaningful action is not giving Patricia money. It is allowing her to be useful, capable, and equal in moments where others would dismiss her. Patricia's most meaningful action is not accepting his luxury. It is choosing him after she has the freedom not to. In conclusion, this story teaches that dignity is not given by wealth, beauty, or physical ability. Dignity comes from being recognized as a whole person. Patricia's journey reminds viewers not to underestimate people who experience the world differently. Her blindness does not make her weak. Society's assumptions about blindness are the real weakness. Paul's journey reminds viewers that power without trust is lonely, and that even the strongest people need someone who can stand beside them without fear or performance. The strongest educational message from this story is this: do not confuse pity with care, control with protection, or being watched with being seen. True love and true respect begin when someone recognizes your full ability, honors your choices, and gives you room to become more yourself, not less.